Hello, I'm John Piquel, and in this 8th of 10 episodes on our theological reflections on the founding and future of the American experiment, our focus is on the difference between the federal government centralism and distributed power state federalism. Just as a reminder, this entire series is focusing on the freedom, two basic freedoms: the spiritual freedom of a Christian, freedom from religion, from the church or any other power controlling one's access to God. We have direct spiritual access to God through Jesus the Christ. And the second are set of political freedoms, which are grounded in the Declaration of Independence, the philosophy of that, and in the Constitution. Well, that's the reminder. Today our focus is on the tug and pull difference between how should the great American experiment government framework be structured. The Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, they were more representative of the of the diverse population of the emerging colonies in the nation. And they wanted weak central government and strong state governments. They were mostly farmers and shopkeepers and laborers, although clearly with Thomas Jefferson we had a very young, sharp intellectual who helped craft, obviously, the Declaration of Independence first and then the Constitution. They believed in democracy and giving all people, educated or not, a voice in the new government. Now the Federalists were centralists. They were relatively few in number, and Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay are some examples. And they felt that they needed to protect from the unruly rule of the hordes. They were fearful of the Shays' Rebellion, for example, and they felt they needed a strong central government. They were mostly property owners, and they believed that the educated should make the decisions, and the common man cannot be trusted to make a smart choice. You see the Venn diagram, state powers on the right in yellow going down to election and criminal laws. On the left in the blue circle, the declaration of war, foreign policy, and then there are some shared responsibilities in the middle. Well, our focus really is not just on the historical summary of how the Constitution was crafted by the Anti-Federalists or the Federalists, but here are some current issues. Election integrity, trying to achieve that, versus voter suppression, restricting the number of people to verifiable citizens of the country. Second, the issue of national popular presidential elections, where the number of people who votes shall determine the presidency, not the electoral college, which gives more power to the smaller states. Third issue, control of federal lands within state borders, the issue of fracking. States is on their territory, but the federal government controls it. Number 4, gun control and gun availability laws. Number 5, the diversity of a woman's right to choose being very important, with relatively relaxed restrictions on abortion, versus some states are focusing on right to life with far stricter controls on access to abortion. Number 6 are the federal incentives to lead or undermine state innovation. 7, imposed federal sexual identity rights and procedures. That has been a recent issue, and some states have a different approach than those who want a universal issue because they feel that human rights and civil rights are at stake. And activist lower court judges setting policy for the whole nation, which is kind of a variation. All of that goes to the fundamental structure of the nation. What should it look like? Just a brief look, because it's injecting a theologically based idea, and that is Lord Acton lived from 1834 to 1902, he was an English Catholic historian and a politician and a writer. Acton took a great deal of interest in the United States, although he was clearly an Englishman, and its federal structure. And he really wanted to focus on how do you achieve a perfect guarantor of individual liberties. During the American Civil War, his sympathies were entirely with the Confederacy, not so much for the issue of slavery, its rightness or wrongness, but because it was, from his perspective, defending the states' rights against a centralized government that he believed would, by what he thought to be historical precedent, inevitably turned and become tyrannical, imposing its will without the say of the diverse populations of the new country. The quotes from Lord Acton, obviously, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power, he said, corrupts absolutely. He also said, liberty is not the power of doing what we like, but the right of being able to do what we ought. What we're going to do now is to summarize the choices so far that we've talked about in this series. We talked about, in the sixth session, the choice between nationalism and globalism. Which philosophy should prevail in the American experiment? Here's Bickel's thought. I believe that God likely favors the American experiment adopting a national perspective rather than a global perspective. Why? Because like God chose the Hebrews and the nation of Israel of biblical days to reveal his expectations for all mankind, in my view, as long as the USA remains true to its founding principle and governing structure championing individual freedom, God, in my view, is choosing the USA nation to help him reveal his plan for all mankind. Therefore, our primary focus as a people should be on discerning and following God's expectations for our country, for the USA, as a major national player on the world stage in helping God realize his plan, God's plan for all mankind. So, Bickel's view is that God still works with nations like he worked with the Hebrews and is calling upon us to exercise our national cohesiveness, hopefully, unity, and yet independence of states in a way that helps God implement his plan for the whole nation. Secondly, I think God most likely favors our adopting the perspective of that America is still exceptional. In my view, God sees the USA as exceptional because both God and the USA place a high value on the freedom of the individual, as Yeshua the divine incarnate showed by saving individuals from their sin in the new covenant, rather than God saving the Hebrew nation from its enemies in the old covenant. So, in my view, and this is a Bickel theological reflection, which may or may not be adequately interpreting God's will, my view, then, is that so long as the USA remains true to its founding principle and governing structure that champions the freedom of the individual, I believe God is using the uniquely exceptional USA, even with its many repairable flaws, to help implement God's plan for all nations and for all mankind. The other fork in the road choice we talked about was what kind of social economic system should the American experiment have? Bickel's perspective is that because, one, mankind is inherently self-centered and competitive, and two, Yeshua the divine incarnate focused on saving individuals rather than groups from sin. In my view, as long as the USA remains true to its founding principle and governing structure championing the freedom of the individual, God prefers American capitalism to socialism as a socioeconomic system because, one, capitalism incentivizes and rewards individuals working with others to use their God-given initiative and talents to better themselves, their families, community, and ultimately all mankind. And secondly, I think God prefers that America use the capitalistic form of organizing economic opportunity is because the USA has a safety net, a self-improvement education system, and a safety net for those who need help to be successful in the highly competitive capitalistic system. That's kind of protecting the downside of excessive brute capitalism. Finally, as we talked about in today's sessions, I do believe that God favors America's decentralized state power. Why? Because given mankind's inherently sinful, self-centered, and competitive nature, and to paraphrase Lord Acton, given that power tends to corrupt and concentrated power tends to corrupt absolutely, as long as the USA, in my view, remains true to its founding principle and governing structure championing the freedom of the individual, I believe God prefers American decentralized shared federal-state power because, one, it provides checks and balances on excessive federal or excessive state power over other states, and two, it fosters multiple, what I call state laboratories of democracy to innovatively find solutions to the USA's and the world's most pressing problems. And there you see all four of my believed to be God's preferences for American nationalism, American exceptionalism, American capitalism, and American decentralized state power. Well, that's as I see it now. How do you see God's favor in relationship, how we should live out the American experiment? I'm John Piquel.